This is about pandemics and transportation, a short history and a likely future. Thanks for joining me. I'm Des Latham. Throughout history, pandemics have been transferred by transport networks. For example, the Antonine Plague during the Roman Empire of 165 AD, where troops brought back what was either smallpox or measles from the Near East. At one point, more than 2,000 people were dying a day in Rome, eventually killing a quarter of the population. It's believed 5 million people died of the Antonine Plague. It arrived by road and sea. Transportation carried the Spanish influenza throughout the world in 1918 and 19 as troops from the First World War were demobilized, taking this terrible disease to all corners of the globe. Transport is what is known as a vector when it comes to pandemics. Let's take a look at what this all means for COVID-19. During the Spanish flu pandemic, the maritime industry was a vector. This time it's aviation as well as the maritime industry. A pandemic is defined as an epidemic of infectious disease that spreads through human populations across a large area and usually worldwide. Over the last 300 years, 10 major influenza pandemics have occurred. The 1918 Spanish flu is considered to be the most destructive to the globe. 30% of the world's population became ill, and between 50 and 100 million had died by 1922. That's why scientists are extremely worried about COVID-19, because it hasn't even got going yet. One important factor why the Spanish flu spread so quickly was through modern transportation. The flu was spread around the world by infected crews and passengers of ships and trains, and severe epidemics occurred in shipyards. This time, the entire speed of transmission has gone up significantly with the aviation industry. Air travel has replaced the ocean-going vessels as the ubiquitous mode of travel these days. Other examples of recent outbreaks include the SARS or severe acute respiratory syndrome in 2002 and 3, and the swine flu in 2009, which all moved around the world largely because of aviation. Authorities managed to stop these because in those cases symptoms appeared before the carrier was really infectious. COVID-19 is very different. It's infectious when carriers have no symptoms. This is the terrifying hidden danger that we all face. As a pandemic sweeps the world, it leads to widespread illness or absenteeism in freight transportation sectors and causes what's known as cascading disruptions of social and economic systems. The relationships between transportation and pandemics involve two major risks. Firstly, transportation is a vector. Many people take public transport and airliners, so this quickly and extensively diffuses a communicable disease. Epidemiologists refer to transportation as a vector, and aviation as a particularly effective vector compared to the maritime industry. Secondly, there's a danger to the continuity of freight distribution. We need things to move around the world, and the pandemic has already affected supply chains. This is almost a dystopian moment. The big thing to keep in mind is that these days, long-distance travel is in hours, not weeks. And modern aircraft speed mean a virus can travel across the world before any symptoms are displayed by the carrier. Sure, you can argue that the rapidity of the transfer also means greater numbers of people are sickened and build immunity. There's a big problem with this analysis. So far, medical experts don't know if we are actually immune after surviving COVID-19, nor for how long this immunity may last. All we know for sure is that blood plasma from survivors helps people recover slightly quicker, but that's not a cure. Since the incubation time for the average influenza virus is between 2 and 7 days, there's ample time for someone who is infected to travel to the other side of the world before noticing symptoms. And COVID-19 is believed to have an incubation period of up to 14 days. This represents what's called a translocation phase and is the most crucial in a pandemic. Once symptoms have developed, there's also a denial phase when an infected individual will continue traveling, and like turtles and whales, we want to head home. Therefore, we infect more people as we rush back to our home bases. Infected people cancel outbound trips, but not inbound. Some even break quarantine to do this, which is both supremely selfish and incredibly stupid. Once an outbreak becomes apparent, the global passenger transportation system can quickly be shut down. But in COVID-19, it happened too late. So, what is the connection between China and the catastrophe we know as COVID-19? In early 2020, the coronavirus pandemic underlined the impact of China's high connectivity in the diffusion of the disease for the following reasons. 1. The epidemic took place during the Chinese New Year, which represents the peak period of passenger mobility within China. In 2019, about 415 million people traveled for the occasion, and many traveled globally, thus disseminating the virus. 2. The growth of domestic air travel and the setting of China's high-speed rail network means it happened much quicker than any other pandemic in history. 3. Chinese citizens traveling around the world for tourism and business purposes have also surged, and they took the virus with them. 4. China has become the world's second largest cruise ship market, with 2.4 million passengers in 2018, further exacerbating the outbreak in 2020. And 5. China is a one-party closed state that manipulates information. In Wuhan, local officials rejected early health workers' reports about a mysterious disease. At least 8 medical staff in Wuhan who reported the virus were imprisoned, and worse, its whistleblower, Dr. Li Wenliang, eventually died of the corona-19 virus. So by late February, flights are being cancelled and a huge number of infections begin to take root in Italy and Spain, the UK, the US, Thailand, South Korea, etc., etc. So what does this all mean for transport? By April 2020, air passenger activity declined by 90 to 95% in most air markets in Europe and North America. The last time an event of that scale happened was in 2010, when European and transatlantic air travel was forced to shut down because of an Icelandic volcanic eruption. But that was only for a few days. This shutdown is going to last months. There is also the continuity of freight transport, which is impacted. However dramatic the impacts of modern transportation as a high-velocity vector for a pandemic, a potentially greater risk resides in the geographical and functional structure of supply chains, because the continuity of freight distribution can be compromised. This is still to play out in the COVID-19 pandemic, and if history is anything to go by, the prognosis is not good. Up to the mid-20th century, the scale of production, transport, and retail was dominantly local or regional, but globalization means that's all changed. The economy of the world is interconnected, which means COVID-19 could become far more devastating economically than the Spanish flu. This has been exacerbated by what is known as the just-in-time delivery. The problem with just-in-time delivery is it is not strategically clever when there's a pandemic. Our forefathers and mothers used to build reserves of food and other goods just in case of a problem like a war or a pandemic. But capitalism has changed. The global economy has been favored by the exploitation of comparative advantages and more tight management of supply chains, because there are fewer companies offering logistics. There are now logistics mega companies. They keep inventories to a minimum through strategies such as just in time, and there is no surge capacity. This was played out in public when European countries and the United States ran out of personal protective equipment quickly. And in fact, health authorities rushed around the globe trying to hijack these important bits of kit, which we know as PPE. 3D printing has helped fill the gap, while innovative reuse of technology by local manufacturers has also helped with things like face masks. But the point remains that global monopoly on freight transportation is an existential threat to many nations. Food is also subject to supply shocks. In Europe, for example, the lack of cheap immigrant labor means food is rotting in the fields. During a quarantine, commercial demand for food drops while consumer demand rises. Supply chains may not be able to respond to the switch of the demand pattern, even if the amount of food produced remains unchanged. Trucks and logistics must be altered to cope with the new characteristic of food purchasing. So pandemics affect supply chains in two fundamental ways. 1. Supply shocks. An unexpected sudden change in the availability of raw materials, parts, goods, and manufacturing capacity is accompanied by a price surge. Face masks that used to cost $1 now cost $20. Depending on the existing buffer, such as stockpiles of energy, grain, and raw materials, the supply shock can take some time to propagate, and we're seeing this in food production and supply. 2. Demand shocks imply a sudden change in demand due to unforeseen circumstances. Hoarding takes place. Witness the lunacy in Australia and the United States, where toilet paper sold out. That's a temporary surge. The other big change has been in energy use, where demand for oil collapsed. Unfortunately for us, the transportation industry has consolidated into a small number of global and national mega players to achieve massive economies of scale, i.e. profits. This is the case for the two most important global freight transportation modules: maritime shipping, air cargo. Economies of scale are important, so fewer behemoths of logistics are able to deliver goods at lower prices because they own and lease more ships and airplanes. In fact, that's how they make their profits. Control access to the network and forget about paying the warehouses. Just move the stuff as people buy it. That's led to what's known as inventory in transit challenges. Inventory in transit challenges, where most supply chains are restocked on a continuous basis on par with demand, which is also known as pull logistics. Typically, air cargo shipments such as pharmaceuticals and electronics are shipped directly from the place of production to markets in a matter of hours. In aviation freight, some aviation companies have taken to delivering freight using passenger aircraft with seats removed or even boxes loaded on seats. But it's critical we identify a major threat to our future. Let's start with food. Contemporary food production and distribution relies on low inventory levels, particularly to avoid wastes of those perishable products on the store shelves. This caught out many American retailers, for example, as COVID-19 spiked in 2020. It also means all those millions of immigrants around the world who come and pick food in fields aren't coming anymore. So food rots. Even when it's picked, there's not enough storage capacity anymore because of, yes, pull logistics. On average, supermarkets have between 2 and 5 days inventory of perishable goods such as dairy, produce, meat, and about 1 to 2 weeks for other goods like pasta, canned goods, and dried foods. It is worth underlining that these figures are for a normal and stable demand. But as COVID-19 accelerated globally, food supplies began to be hoarded. Pasta sold out. Bread disappeared. Tinned tomatoes could not be found in some places. The big problem with food hoarding during a pandemic, it's not like hoarding for fear of an approaching hurricane, for example. Storms are regional or local, but a pandemic means the challenge is at a national or international level. That places intense pressure on food distribution suddenly and emphatically. Hoarding creates stress on supply chains by moving the inventory from stores and distribution centers to residences. Replenishing inventory at a time of pandemic takes much longer than responding to hurricane hoarding. Restaurants close, which means grocers become more important and producers then shift logistics to cater, if you excuse the pun, for the change. Food security is therefore defined as the ability of the transportation workers to move food from producers to bulk storage facilities, to processors, and lastly to grocers. This is playing out now as we battle the coronavirus, so keep your eye on food. The second big effect is on energy. We all need fuel and electricity. For instance, about 40% of the world's supply of electricity is generated by burning coal. Coal burning plants maintain a fairly low stockpile, around 30 days, and rely on a constant supply from major coal mining regions, which can be far away. On the positive side, a pandemic should be associated with a substantial drop in energy demand, and we have seen that as institutional and manufacturing activities are curtailed, and commuting is reduced as international transportation such as air travel and maritime shipping declines. The outcome is a sharp drop in energy prices due to the lack of demand. And that's why, for the first time in history, the fuel price dropped into minus territory. In other words, had you bought oil on that day, someone would have paid you to buy it because you have to find somewhere expensive to store it, like a supertanker parked offshore, which costs up to $300,000 a day to hire. The third area is medical supplies. A pandemic is obviously associated with a surge in the use of medical facilities, equipment, and pharmaceutical product. This has become a matter of national security interest, with recent events such as buyers for the United States trying to hijack masks destined for Germany in China. This is where the economics of scale have also led to strategic threats. Global drug production is controlled by a few large conglomerates that maintain a limited number of facilities at selected locations. Commonly, a single drug is produced at a single plant. If global distribution systems were impaired during a pandemic, many essential drugs would have difficulties to reach patients, while limited stockpiles maintained at medical facilities would quickly run out. This happened when the intellectually challenged American President Trump suggested the malaria medicine called hydroxychloroquine would help combat COVID-19. Supplies of this malaria drug ran out across the world. It doesn't work, by the way. The United States buys 95% of all generic drugs from China and India. A similar pattern applies to critical medical equipment such as ventilators, with local manufacturers in countries across the world now trying to produce these very quickly themselves. Ventilators are literally more valuable than Rolls Royces. COVID-19 is only getting started. Keep an eye out on these three things: food, energy, medical resources. It's going to get very messy out there. So what can we do to mitigate this as countries and people? Since pandemics have been an enduring concern, many government agencies have developed their own pandemic plans. Unfortunately, in some countries, the US for example, the political leadership decided to scrap its pandemic warning team as a cost-cutting exercise. Bad mistake. It's like switching off the radar while they're incoming bombers. It's also crucial for airlines and key airports to maintain air travel capabilities with a pool of available aircraft, pilots and controllers, and ground personnel. It mitigates the risk by subsidizing the industry in the short term, as many airlines are already technically bankrupted by this coronavirus. Let's turn to maritime shipping quickly. The demand for maritime transportation declines during a pandemic, but at a lesser rate than air travel. The demand for raw materials and energy declines as well, impacting bulk shipping. Port terminals may face a rationalization by shutting down some terminals and concentrating activities at terminals that are safest and most efficient. The international maritime domain presents unique challenges as it plays a fundamental role in supporting the global distribution of essential commodities like food, energy, and parts, and finished goods. And this is where things are ominously similar to the outbreak of Spanish flu in 1918. Transportation workers are high priority during the present COVID-19 outbreak. More important than presidents or senators. You could live without your president, but you can't live without grain being shipped through your port. The basic strategy to protect the transportation system is to provide workers with personal protective gear and special shielding operations. This is not an idle statement. In the world today, there are what are called logistics strongholds that include ports, airports, and logistic zones. These are vital strategic cogs, and in the future, countries are going to take a very close look at who supplies them with what. This, of course, is going to impact China's role as a manufacturing center, because it's very clear that you can't trust Beijing to provide you with crucial life-saving information quickly enough. Time to move manufacturing to other countries, which may happen quite soon. We'll see. So, what about the post-pandemic recovery? Once a pandemic is receding, the main concerns shift towards the resuming of economic and transport activities. Since the pandemic does not diffuse uniformly in space and in time, sequencing becomes a core issue. We are going to face waves of pandemic outbreaks through 2020 and possibly into 2021 and later maybe. Some sectors like aviation will take far longer to recover, as long as 5 to 10 years. Strategic gateways and corridors are vital. Countries will reassess their transport plans. The impacts on behavioral norms and commercial operations are yet to be fully realized, but here are a few. When will UEFA football competition pick up once more? Will you be attending a rock concert in the next year? How about rubbing shoulders at a major conference? When do you think that'll be acceptable? And when will tourism become acceptable again? Changes will take place in sourcing goods and securing supply chains to avoid uncertainty and vulnerability, including warehousing and storage, which may increase. Re-evaluation of the just-in-time model for critical supply chains will take place. Will Walmart move away from just-in-time if it's going to hit their bottom line? Possibly, although large wholesalers and retailers may face legislation forcing them to do so. Countries will move away from China as a core manufacturing area for strategic goods, particularly medical supplies. It has become patently clear that buying personal protective gear from other countries is strategically dumb. It's a real risk to your own people. If you can produce these things even at a higher cost, you're going to. The role of the World Health Organization is going to change, particularly with reference to why it took so long to declare a pandemic, and the role of the Chinese officials in throwing medical doctors in jail for telling the truth. The oil industry may change fundamentally because of this COVID-19 virus, particularly the fracking industry in America, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Nigeria, Venezuela. Many of these will experience social instability in the next few years because they won't recover in the short term. So the outlook following COVID-19 is still a little murky. China has refused to allow WHO inspectors in to probe the outbreak, leading to conclusions that it has a great deal to hide. One thing is certain, This won't be the last pandemic, and global transport will be a crucial vector in the future. Another thing is certain: China's so-called wet markets, where wild animals are traded, is going to cause another outbreak of a zoological virus, because at least 3 have emanated from there in the last 17 years. I'm Des Latham.